Okay, so welcome everyone to our class on the book Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior. Tonight we'll be talking about chapters 3 and 4, titled The Genuine Heart of Sadness and Fear and Fearlessness. But before we get to those chapters, there are a few things I wanted to say and also wanted to do a little bit of review. Wanted to thank everyone for attending and for the interest in this class. I've actually had an enjoyable, although somewhat stressful, time looking for materials and old notes, and I really enjoyed becoming familiar again with the Shambhala teachings. My interest has always leaned more toward Trungpa Rinpoche's Buddhist teachings, but I've always had tremendous appreciation at the same time for the Shambhala teachings. And I'm really happy to be plunging back into that. I found some very old notes that were kind of interesting about Shambhala. Goes back a good 40 years, where the presenter made a few points about the Shambhala teachings relative to the Buddhist teachings. One of the things that he says that in one sense, the Shambhala teachings don't say anything different than Buddhism, but does say it in different terms. And this in itself can be helpful because sometimes certain words, phrases, and ideas resonate more for some people than others. And so there might be points or an entire approach that just works for somebody, whereas a different approach, even though it may get to the same place and be talking about the same things, doesn't work as well. And then at other times, sometimes just hearing it in a couple of different ways makes it easier to get at what all the words are pointing to, because ultimately what we're talking about is our experience, our actual experience. And the words and the concepts that help us get there can be helpful in pointing things out, but ultimately what it comes down to is what we actually experience. So for that reason, I'm going to do my best to stick to the Shambhala language and Shambhala logic, but I may from time to time slip into some more Buddhist, more traditionally Buddhist terminology. But I'm going to do my best to really stick to the logic and language that Trungpa Rinpoche used to present the Shambhala teachings. Having said that, I'm going to veer off into traditional Buddhist thinking for just a moment, because one of the other things that we were told, that I was told when we first introduced the Shambhala teachings, this is a very fruitional approach. And if you remember from the class that we had on the first talk on the the path of indestructible wisdom, the Vajrayana text that we began. One of the things that it said there was it talked about the difference between Mahayana and Vajrayana, that the Mahayana presented Buddha nature as an essence, whereas Vajrayana presents it as, full-blown Buddhahood, that we actually can realize Buddhahood on the spot. And in this sense, this is what the Shambhala teachings are. As Trungpa Rinpoche said in the Path of Indestructible Wisdom, that first talk on the dawn of the Great Eastern Sun that we discussed a couple of weeks back, he said, if you do not realize the seed, you cannot have an understanding of the fruit. In the Vajrayana, the ground is more emphasized, but in order to realize the ground, you have to go through the disciplines. And when the ground is realized, that is attainment. So the ground is the fruition. And this is true for all Vajrayana teachings. In this case, we're talking about Shambhala, but it's really true for all Vajrayana teachings. The ground is the fruition. So, and further says that understanding the ground as the fruition means that there is fruit already. And this is exactly how the Shambhala teachings work. We begin with the recognition of basic goodness. And then the complete fulfillment of Shambhala vision of Shambhala is full realization of basic goodness. A traditional Buddhist path, beginning with the Hinayana, begins by looking at the nature of our suffering and confusion, and eventually leads to liberation. The Shambhala teachings begin right off by saying that in a sense, even though we don't realize it, we're already liberated. We already have everything we need in order to become fully liberated. So we begin by seeing basic goodness, coming to some understanding of basic goodness, coming to understand that we are basic goodness. And then we cultivate that and remove the obstacles to its fullest expression. Um, I've always found for that reason that the Shambhala teachings are challenging in a way, at least for me, are in a way that is both exciting and sometimes difficult, that there's no place to hide, that we just begin right away with the notion of basic goodness and how to cultivate or develop that. Another thing, although this won't be so much the focus of what we'll be talking about tonight, is there's more of an emphasis in the Shambhala teachings on how we manifest in the world. And you got a taste of that in some of the readings we've done so far, where he says, look at your domestic reality, how you comb your hair, the way you dress, how you wash your clothes. All those all those activities are an extension of sanity. They are a way of connecting with reality. So much of Shambhala relates to how we can manifest basic goodness in our lives and in the world. Relates to how we can manifest basic goodness, dignity, appreciation, confidence, and fearlessness in our lives. And the overall idea is that for this to be genuine, it must be unconditional. That is, not related to anything else as its basis. In other words, when it's this confidence, basic goodness, dignity isn't related to anything conditional, like having the best job or the most money, the greatest status. You can be dignified with nothing to prop us up because we already are basic goodness. We already have basic goodness. And the real question is, do we recognize that or not? So, and that's, I think, the thrust of a lot of what we're reading about in these first chapters. The overall title for this entire section, all these chapters, is How to Be a Warrior. And what it comes down to is being able to recognize our inherent basic goodness, allow this to occur when we do recognize this. This particularly relates to the heart of sadness that we'll be talking about in a little bit. And through repeated experiences, repeated practice, and repeated recognition, we come to habituate ourselves to that, so that eventually, and develop confidence in our basic goodness, so that finally there's a switch of allegiance that we've talked about before. In some ways, it's very much like, and again, this is just why this has the flavor of the Vajrayana, some of the instruction that's in the italics to the Sadhana Mahamudra, where it says, be decisive, know what is, see clearly. So we have this ability. The question is, do we recognize it or not? And so for that reason, especially in these introductory chapters, these beginning chapters of the Sacred Path of the Warrior, Trungpa Rinpoche spends a lot of time introducing us to what we already have, or what we already are, in terms of our basic goodness. So as he says right at the beginning, that he's presented these teachings using the image of the kingdom of Shambhala to represent the idea of secular enlightenment. That is the possibility of uplifting our personal existence and that of others without the help of any religious outlook. And he says that the Shambhala teachings are founded on the premise that there is basic human wisdom that can help solve the world's problems. This wisdom does not belong to any culture or religion. Rather, it's a tradition of human warriorship that has existed in many cultures at many times throughout history. So that this basic goodness is just part of our human makeup. It's just part of who we are. It's a part of how all humans are. And ultimately all beings, but that comes a little later. But in terms of what warriorship means, and I think this is important to review the meaning of warriorship, because we'll be talking about fear and fearlessness in a little bit. It goes on to say that warriorship in this context does not refer to making war on others, that in fact aggression is the source of our problems, not the solution. But that here the word warrior comes from the Tibetan word pawo, which means literally means one who is brave. And that he says this is the key to warriorship, and the first principle of Shambhala vision is not being afraid of who you are, who we are. And so I think that that's a worthwhile question to think a little bit about in terms of our contemplation of what we're reading. Are we afraid of who we are? And if so, in what ways? And how does this manifest in how we present ourselves to the world? So I think that's, it's just something that we should think about. Are we afraid of who we are? Trungpa Rinpoche often said that it was a real surprise to him that when he came to the West, that the notion of original sin was really surprising to him because it's so contrary to the outlook of the traditions that he came from. But if we begin with some position, some belief that there is something wrong with us, some kind of doubt about ourselves, some feeling that we're lacking, some feeling that we can't trust ourselves, some feeling that if we aren't constantly in some way disciplining in ourselves or controlling ourselves, that we will be afraid of who we are. And this will affect how we relate to ourselves and others. Yet we won't be able to open ourselves to ourselves. So this is why he says that ultimately that is the definition of bravery, not being afraid of who we are. And he says we can be heroic and kind at the same time, and that this has nothing to do with selfishness. Shambhala vision is the opposite of selfishness. When we're afraid of ourselves and afraid of the seeming threat the world presents, then we become extremely selfish. We want to build our own little nests, our own cocoons, so that we can live by ourselves in a secure way. So we're actually talking about not being afraid of ourselves so that we can open up, first of all, to ourselves, as we'll talk about in a little bit, and then so we can be open to the world around us, because we can let go of our need to constantly be on the defensive, to constantly be on the alert to threats, both within and without. So he says that basically this comes from coming to recognize, coming to notice our basic goodness, which he says comes from appreciating very simple experiences. And you'll notice that the word appreciation and appreciating comes up quite a bit in these chapters. And I think it has to do with, first of all, being able to just notice, being aware, being able to see things for what they are. And he says that we experience glimpses of goodness all the time, but we often fail to acknowledge them. And we do this because we get so caught up in our speed, our self-preoccupation, goal orientation, distractions of all kinds, and we're just simply not present, so that we can't appreciate what we don't notice. And this is why, one of the reasons why I think he spends so much time just talking about basic goodness, so that we have this opportunity, we can take the opportunity to begin to appreciate who we are, so that we can begin to realize we don't need to be afraid of who we are. So what he says is every human being has a basic nature which is undiluted and unconfused. That goodness contains tremendous gentleness and appreciation. So there was the word appreciation again. As human beings, we're basically awake and we can understand reality. The discovery of basic goodness is the realization that we can directly experience and work with reality. And of course, as part of this, a vital part of this is working with the practice of sitting meditation, because that's what allows us to begin to settle down, slow the speed of our mind, simplify, so that we can actually pay attention and begin to notice the things that we might be able to appreciate, instead of being so caught up in getting to the next moment or regretting the previous moment that we fail to appreciate the present moment. He says a great deal of the chaos in the world occurs because people don't appreciate themselves. So again, appreciation. Having never developed sympathy or gentleness toward themselves, people cannot experience harmony or peace within themselves, and therefore what they project to others is also inharmonious and confused. But the point is, when we don't, as he says, when we don't punish or condemn ourselves, when we're not afraid of who we are, when we're able to just simply be with who we are, when we don't punish or condemn ourselves, we can relax and appreciate our body and mind. We can begin to contact the fundamental notion of basic goodness in ourselves. So it's extremely important to be willing to open ourselves to ourselves. I'm changing the pronouns a little bit. In the text, it's open yourself to yourself, but I certainly include myself in the need to do that. So developing tenderness toward yourself allows you to see your problems and your potential accurately. So in this sense, in other contexts, he talks a great deal about the importance of gentleness in regard to meditation practice and in terms of how we relate to ourselves. And basically, in this context, gentleness is the simple way in meditation practice where we just allow ourselves to be as we are, that we actually can relate to our experience and whatever arises in our experience without judgment, without feeling that we need to change ourselves in some way, without feeling that we're lacking something, without feeling that we need to take something in that we don't have, and without feeling that we necessarily need to rid ourselves of anything either. And this is the very simple experience in meditation practice of allowing our experience and allowing ourselves to be just as we are. That we don't have to relate to ourselves and our experience with endless judgment, endless feeling that somehow things should be different or better in some way. And we can just be with ourselves in meditation practice and be with our experience just as it is. In one sense, this should be really easy. I mean, it's simple, but it's actually not easy because we're not habituated to being that way with ourselves. So it's the difficulty in the practice actually comes from the way in which we've been habituated to being distracted, habituated to not trusting ourselves, habituated to feeling somehow that we should be different, we should be more, that we're lacking in some way. There are all kinds of patterns for how we might fail to allow ourselves to simply be in the moment. But ultimately, as he says, it's extremely important to be willing to open ourselves to ourselves and to do so with gentleness, non-judgment, non-aggression, we could say. He says we don't have to ignore our problems or exaggerate our potential. Gentleness toward ourselves and appreciation of ourselves is very necessary. And that this is how we come to be able to recognize our basic goodness. I think if we actually look honestly at our experience, especially conventional experience in the world, that we actually do spend a lot of time ignoring problems and exaggerating our potential. And in this case, we're simply allowing ourselves in meditation practice to be as we are. Because what we discover in meditation practice is we have a working basis to uplift our existence and cheer ourselves up fully that's always available to us. So that's how we come to cultivate our basic goodness. Essentially, it's a matter of recognizing and appreciating what we already have, what we already are, and who we already are. And a lot of times we might think about being kind to ourselves in terms of engaging in pleasurable activities. And there's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, in terms of meditation practice, it's much simpler. We don't need to change anything fundamentally about ourselves. We can learn to just simply settle and be with ourselves and be with our experience without having to fix anything or look for anything better or different than what we are. So with that understanding, with the notion of coming to allowing ourselves to appreciate, recognize, and appreciate our basic goodness, and with the understanding that doing so in the Shambhala tradition involves warriorship, being brave. And being brave in this sense is just simply facing ourselves, facing our life, and doing so in the spirit of simplicity and being present, and allowing ourselves to simply be. We can begin talking about the first chapter that we read for tonight, The Genuine Heart of Sadness. Let me say a couple things about sadness in this context, because in other places, he makes it really clear that this has nothing to do with depression, nothing to do with a poverty mentality of any kind. And in fact, sometimes when he talked about sadness in this context, he actually talked about sadness and delight coming together, sadness and joy. And with this, I actually wanted to read just an excerpt from some notes that from level 5 that I took many years ago, where he said, sad and joy. When we talk about ordinary sad, we talk about how hurt we are. And when we talk about joy, we're so excited. But this is all one-sided. In Shambhala, we develop sad and joy at once. You feel both. We feel sad, tender, like being in love the first time. Very touching, very sad. They go together like hot and cold, sweet and sour at the same time. You should feel sad and joy all the time, full of vision, yet tender. So that's what we're working with here. This are the experiences we have of being completely open, exposed, tender, and that these experiences can be both happy and sad at the same time. Like think of, certain, especially life events like weddings where people cry, childbirth, graduations, where there is that feeling of both sadness and joy at the same time. But even simple experiences of being alone and perhaps watching a sunset or seeing a beautiful, pleasing garden and wanting to share that with somebody else, that there's a touch of sadness to that. It's not, again, it's not depression. It's not, it's not a poverty mentality or a feeling of anything having to do with being wronged at all. It's more a feeling of being alive and being touched and being open and being experiencing the beauty of the moment, but also the transitory nature of the moment. That part of experiencing that happy, sad feeling is that it can't be grasped. It's a transitory moment that's beautiful, but also at the same time ceasing to exist. In the chapter, he begins by asking us to imagine that someone sitting on the ground, completely naked, exposed to heaven above and earth below. And he says that earth is always earth. The earth will let anyone sit on it. The earth never gives way. It never lets you go. And that the sky is always there. We know that heaven and earth are trustworthy. They just are. And the logic of basic goodness is very similar. It just is. When we speak of basic goodness, we're not talking about allegiance to good and rejecting bad, he says. It's basic goodness because it is unconditional or fundamental. In other words, it's not based on this related to that. It just is. It's there already, he says, in the same way that heaven and earth are already here. That we don't reject the sun and moon, we accept them. We accept that the sky is blue. And that basic goodness in that that's basic goodness is that basic, that unconditional, that it's not a view of for or against in the same way that sunlight is not for and against. And he goes on to talk about the natural order of the world, which is also not for or against, that there's fundamentally nothing that either threatens us or promotes our point of view, that there's just a natural order to things that we can follow, that we can't alter the seasons, just as we can't alter, day and night the way that they alternate with each other. And he says that we often take for granted this basic law and order, this basic sense of order in the world and in the universe. But he says we should think twice. And again, this comes back to noticing and appreciating or recognizing that, again, he says we should appreciate what we have, that if there was no sunlight, there would be no crops. And he extends this to our capability, he extends this same idea to our capabilities as human beings, where he says we have teeth and to fight, we have genitals to make love, and so on and so forth, that this is our makeup. And that the point that this is just how we are. And that the point of warriorship, the point of being brave, or the bravery, is to work personally with our situation now. The point of warriorship is to work personally with our situation now as it is. Which again seems like such a simple statement, but when we look at the world around us, we realize how few people do this or even recognize the value or the importance of doing this. Working personally with our situation now as it is, that the vast majority of people spend their time in dreams or nightmares, depending. Um, and that we're very fortunate in having had presented to us the practice of meditation and having some understanding of why meditation is important in terms of opening ourselves to ourselves and in terms of being able to work personally with our situation now as it is. Anyway, he goes on to say that when we say human beings are basically good, we mean that they have every faculty that they need, so they don't need to fight with the world. In other words, we can experience contentment in the moment. We can just simply be in the present without needing anything else. He says, our being good is not a source of fundamental aggression or complaint. Our being is good because, our being is good because it is not a source of fundamental aggression or complaint. But how many people experience the world that way? For how many people is, in fact, their life a source of aggression or complaint? So the fact that we can actually realize something different is so important and so significant. That we actually can allow ourselves to practice meditation and become increasingly able to recognize our basic goodness, our basic openness, our basic intelligence, our basic capacity for kindness and compassion and love. So he says, for this reason, we should feel that it's wonderful to be in this world. So the first step, again, the first step in realizing basic goodness is to appreciate what we have. In other words, the first step is just recognizing that. Slowing down, simplifying, and being able to recognize basic goodness. But then he says we should look further. One point, time to time in my study, I've noticed from time to time how certain phrases will start to jump out at me. And at one point I noticed that he actually does say, look further, quite a bit. And the idea is, well, we'll talk about it in a little bit when we talk about fear and fearlessness, because there's definitely an element of looking further in regard to working with fear. But then we should look further and more precisely at what we are, where we are, who we are. And he says, this, one of the few times where he actually uses a Buddhist term, that basic goodness is closely connected to the idea of bodhicitta, or awakened heart. And he says, such awakened heart comes from being willing to face your state of mind. So again, opening ourselves to ourselves, working with ourselves in terms of meditation practice. And he says, we should examine ourselves and ask how many times we've tried to connect with our heart fully and truly. How often have we turned away because we feared we might discover something terrible about ourselves? So we're back again to that question about, do we fear ourselves in some way? How often have we been able to, how often have we been willing to look at our face in the mirror without being embarrassed? How many times have we tried to shield ourselves by reading the newspaper, watching television, or just spacing out? So the experience of basic goodness is one of just simply being awake and alive. He says the sitting practice of meditation is the means to rediscover basic goodness. And beyond that is the means to awaken this genuine heart within yourself. When you sit upright but relaxed in the posture of meditation, your heart is naked. Your entire being is exposed to yourself, first of all, but to others as well. So through the practice of sitting still and following your breath as it goes out and dissolves, we connect with our heart. By simply letting ourselves be as we are, we develop genuine sympathy toward ourselves. And again, this sympathy is that ability to simply be with ourselves without judgment, without trying to change ourselves, without feeling that we somehow need to be different or that we're lacking something, and just simply be, and that we begin to experience this through the practice of meditation. He goes on to say, when we awaken our heart in this way, when we're present with ourselves, present with our experience, we find to our surprise that the heart is empty. If you really look, we can't find anything tangible or solid. He does say, of course, you might find something solid if we have a grudge against someone or we've fallen possessively in love, but that's not awakened heart. That's what happens when we harden ourselves, close up, or end up grasping at things. that we end up solidifying. But when we're open, awake, and aware, we're aware of this feeling. We have this feeling of happy, sad, sad and joy, awakened heart. But if we search for that, we can't find a single location for it. As he says, if you put your hand through your rib cage, there's nothing there except for tenderness. There's just the experience. There's just the feeling. There's the awareness, the awakeness. We feel sore and soft. And if we open our eyes to the rest of the world, you feel tremendous sadness. And again, the sadness is not because we feel impoverished or mistreated, not depression. It's just simple openness, simply that we are capable of allowing the world to touch us, and that our hearts are tender and open. Rather, this experience of sadness is unconditioned. It occurs because your heart is completely exposed. Our experience is so raw and tender and so personal. So we're talking about experience of complete openness and also connectedness with the world around us. Perhaps sadness and other things. Again, sadness at the transitory nature of things, even as we appreciate and enjoy. Sadness in the awareness of suffering of beings. But Trungpa Rinpoche actually says, I think this will probably come up later in the text, but that actually we develop kindness through our experience of the heart of sadness. That this openness, this tenderness, this willingness to be touched, this willingness to expose ourselves to the world, this willingness to expose ourselves to ourselves, this is how we develop kindness, first to ourselves and then to other beings, because of the tender nature of the awakened heart. He says that this genuine heart of sadness comes from feeling that your non-existent heart is so full to the brim. You'd like to give your heart to others. For the warrior, again, the one who is brave, the one who is able to just be fully with our experience in the present. For the warrior, this experience of sad and tender heart is what gives birth to fearlessness. That real fearlessness is the product of tenderness. You're willing to open up without resistance or shyness and face the world. You're willing to share your heart with others. So being able to recognize this heart of sadness, this experience of fullness, this experience of aliveness, this experience of complete openness, and having recognized allowing this so that we're not afraid of this, this is the journey, the path of warriorship. And I think it's self-evident in some way why this involves bravery, why this involves one who is brave. And it also leads, I think, quite logically to the next chapter on fear and fearlessness. So just a couple of things about fear. We're not talking in terms of fearlessness in this story about ignoring danger or very real kinds of things that might be dangerous to us. There's something, well, maybe this is a bit of an aside, but I'll share it. I think people know that I, did the psychology program at Naropa Institute years ago. And one of the things we learned to do in working with people was to look for some understanding of how they work with their mind, and even perhaps what kinds of practices they might have. It's not always easy to figure out because many times people either don't even recognize that it is a practice and don't share it, or tends to be very private. But I worked with one adolescent once who was actually fairly insightful, surprisingly, about how he worked with fear. And his whole thing was he wanted to not be afraid, that he wanted to, he felt it was really important to not be afraid. And so he told me he did very deliberate things, like deliberately walk through graveyard at night just to show that he wouldn't be afraid. This is not true fearlessness. This is, in psychological terms, it's counterphobic. But the problem is that, and this is the problem that he ran into and that I tried talking to him a great deal about, is that real fearlessness does not involve ignoring or trying to deaden fear. As Trungpa Rinpoche, it involves going beyond fear. And that more importantly, in order to experience fearlessness, it's necessary to experience fear to begin with. That the essence of cowardice, the essence of not being a warrior, is not acknowledging the reality of fear. So having said that, again, we're talking about this aspect of warriorship, experiencing, developing fearlessness. Trungpa Rinpoche went through some of the types of fear, including the fear of death, the fear of being inadequate or overwhelmed by the demands of the world, and then the kind of abrupt fear and panic that can happen with sudden new experiences. And he says sometimes fear manifests itself in restlessness, that we just have to keep moving, twitching, with that kind of anxiety. And he says that ordinarily we develop all kinds of strategies to manage fear, to take our minds off of it through entertainment and preoccupation, like watching TV or reading. He mentions yoga as well, or numbing ourselves. He talks about tranquilizers, although really kind of numbing could apply to any kind of substance abuse, where we're not opening ourselves to ourselves, or we're. He says, from a coward's point of view, boredom should be avoided because when we're bored, we begin to feel anxious. He says, fear has to be acknowledged. We have to realize our fear and reconcile ourselves with fear. And he says we could look at how fear is manifested in our restlessness, our difficulty just simply staying on the spot. Let alone, our immediate reactiveness to certain situations where we just ought to, pull away in a reflexive way without thinking. And this is important in relation to the sad and tender heart that we just talked about, because it takes bravery to allow ourselves to be exposed and open to the world. And for that reason, we have to work with our fear. We have to work with whatever fear we might have, fear of being embarrassed, inadequate, fear of whatever experience of fear we might have. And he says that acknowledging fear is not a cause for depression or discouragement, but because we possess such fear, we're actually entitled to experience fearlessness. And he says true fearlessness is not the reduction of fear, but it's going beyond fear. In other words, by fearless, he says, we don't mean less fear, but beyond fear. So you might say, what does beyond mean? And I think basically this is one of the places where we talk about looking further, as we talked about before, that if we can maintain some sense of stability and awareness, that we can actually look at our experience when we begin to feel fear, anxiety, restlessness. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about a situation of real danger, but the kind of danger we might feel in regard to our openness, our willingness to be open. He says, going beyond fear begins when we examine our fear. Again, looking further. We begin to examine our anxiety and nervousness, our concern and restlessness. So again, looking further, as opposed to simply reacting and reflexively jumping away or jumping into habitual pattern of perhaps entertaining or distracting ourselves or whatever we habitually do. If we look into fear, if we look beneath, he says, if we look beneath the veneer, the first thing we find is sadness, which is calm and gentle. So again, we're talking about touching this exposed, tender, open, awake heart. And that's what lies underneath our experience of fear, anxiety, and restlessness. He says nervousness is cranking up, vibrating all the time. But when we slow down, when we relax with our fear, we find sadness. And he says this could be, and he talks about this, it begins with a feeling in the chest, and then might be tears in our eyes, we might cry, might feel sad and lonely. And he says this is the first tip of fearlessness and the first sign of real warriorship. Again, being brave, being able to stay with our experience, being able to look further at our experience rather than slipping into habitual pattern, numbness, distraction, or whatever it is. He says in the Shambhala tradition, fearlessness comes from working with the softness of the human heart. And he gives us an analogy for this as a practice, the development of the reindeer's horns. That as we first begin to do this, as we first begin to work with our experience in this way, in sitting meditation or in the world, that we don't know quite what to do at first, but then it begins to feel more natural. And he says, in the same way, when a person first gives birth to this tender heart of warriorship, he or she may feel extremely awkward or uncertain about how to relate to this kind of fearlessness. But then, as we experience the sadness more and more, we realize that human beings should be tender and open, that this is, in fact, the very essence of being human, you could say. So we no longer need to feel shy or embarrassed about being gentle. And he says, in fact, your softness begins to become passionate. You'd like to extend yourself to others and communicate with them. So, I said I wouldn't veer off into too much of the Buddhist tradition, but I just want to say there's a very clear ground path and fruition in how he presents working with fear here. That the ground at first is recognizing fear and being able to stay with it. That the path is examining, looking further at fear and seeing through to sad, tender, open heart beyond fear. And the fruition is we become more familiar and confident in our ability to be with and express tender, open heart and open ourselves to the world. So very clear, I think, progression here in terms of what we're being asked to do, what we're being asked to recognize and work with. So he says, when tenderness evolves in that direction, then we can truly appreciate the world around you. So again, the word appreciation, noticing, being able to stay with experience and open ourselves up. Sense perceptions become interesting things. We're so tender and open that we cannot help opening ourselves to what takes place around us. And he says, when we see someone else crying or laughing or being afraid, we respond to them as well. At that point, our beginning level of fearlessness is developing further into warriorship, where again, the warrior is the one who is brave. Situations become very real, quite real, and on the other hand, quite ordinary. So he concludes the chapter, as I will conclude what I have to say tonight, by saying that the ideal of warriorship is that the warrior should be sad and tender, and because of that, the warrior can be brave as well. Without heartfelt sadness, bravery is brittle. But he says the bravery of a warrior is resilient. He talks about it as like a lacquer cup that bounces but doesn't break. The bravery of the warrior is soft and hard at the same time. So that's what I had to present. If there are questions, comments, thoughts, please feel free to share. Steve?
Thank you very much for that. That was very, very helpful. I'm still a little confused, or I'm not sure I understand what beyond fear is. I understand that you're confronting fear, looking at fear, but I'm still unclear as to what beyond fear is referring to.
You know, I was reading this, I was remembering the line in Dune that fear is the mind killer. If you've read the science fiction book. So I think going beyond fear is not letting it kill our mind, that we're able to experience fear. It's not that we're ignoring it or you know, suppressing it, but at the same time, we're not giving in our habitual way, so that we're able to experience fear within the greater space of awareness, which gives us the possibility to work with it and to examine. That's what I think he means by looking at it and examining it. Oh, I forgot. I'm glad you asked that question, because it reminded me of another thing that it was interesting to me in reading these two chapters tonight, that were both heart of sadness, genuine heart of sadness, and fear relate to emotions. And if people have not read the section in Trungpa Rinpoche's book, The Myth of Freedom, there's a section called Working with the Emotions. And it really is, it's excellent in terms of working with feelings altogether. But I think that, it's exactly that we don't try to suppress or deny fear, but we don't react in a unthinking, habitual, reactive way.
Right.
And that allows us to go beyond fear. It doesn't mean that we're still not fearful, but we're perhaps capable of responding in a way that's helpful to the situation, rather than again not being able to respond well at all. Laura?
Thank you.
Yeah. See, Laura has her hand raised. But
not really on purpose. I'm trying to move from one room to another, get a better signal. But
right.
I did want to ask, I have a hard time with the word sadness.
Mm-hmm.
What fits better with me is, I don't know if I'm saying the word correctly, but pungent, or bittersweet, or maybe I equate sadness too much with like depression, sadness.
Yeah, and he's very clear that it's not depression, but I agree with you. This, John asked if I'd be willing to teach tonight, and I said yes before I looked at the chapters, because this is always one that's thrown me a little bit, because it's not a sadness, but I think poignant is a good way to put it. Bittersweet would also be good. I mean, that's why I brought up that times when, and in other texts, he talks about it as both happy, sad, or, sadness and delight at the same time. So that it's clearly not depression. He says it's clearly not anything that comes out of poverty mentality or a feeling that we've been mistreated in some way. I really think it really emphasizes the sense that our experience really touches us and that it is tender. But it's
like raw, vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Sadness maybe connotates loss to me, and I'm not sure. Maybe there is loss, like loss of our ego and being willing to be just out here. But I that's kind of a thought in my head, a logical connection. It's not a felt experience of sadness for me.
And I think sometimes I've had to, again, kind of look at my own experience and try to figure in what way do I experience this? And, I think that's something for all of us to contemplate, actually. John and Dan? Go ahead, John. Yeah. Oh, you're muted, though.
For me, one of the keys to these chapters has to do with self-criticism and self-hatred. Feeling that I'm inadequate in a given situation. And then the inevitable awkwardness and reactivity that I go through if I do feel a sense of inadequacy. And I think that what he's talking about, especially in the first of these two chapters about basic goodness, is beginning to see that we're not inadequate, that we are fundamentally, as these teachings say, basically good, wholesome. And that with that in mind, we can respond to situations much more wholeheartedly and generously and kindly and with interest, because we are not protecting this negatively viewed self that we have. We're not flinching from being seen. And so that's my feeling when I read the chapter on basic goodness, chapter 3, having to do with that, that really it's revolutionary. He's urging us that we could see ourselves as being wholesome and whole rather than flawed and imperfect. And that at the same time that we do that, we can see the nature of our fear. Our fear is that we are inadequate and that we have to somehow compensate or protect for that inadequacy. So this really is a matter of, he's urging us on the one hand to fall in love with ourselves, so maybe not fall in love with, but appreciate our own wholesomeness, and then that enables us to connect with the world around us and others with a kind of gentleness and appreciation and tenderness that we wouldn't otherwise have. So that message to me is very revolutionary, that we can actually appreciate ourselves first, and that then enables us to be much more present for the world and communicate with the world and be of benefit to the world.
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That was really, really great presentation. I had another response to Laura's question or comment, and then I'll ask you what I want to ask you. I've always differentiated between depression and sadness, both on a professional level and a personal level, because sadness, no matter how aversive it may feel or how unwanted, it's a full affect. And depression is just what it says. It's depressed affect. It's a inability to experience things fully, or not an inability, but a difficulty with experiencing things fully. And one of those things could be sadness, but certainly joy and more pleasurable things. So anyway, that's just my comment to that. My question was, do you think Trungpa Rinpoche is either explicitly or implicitly saying that all neurotic, aversive feelings, sadness, anxiety, depression, comes from a failure to recognize our basic goodness? Is that the core root, right? And then as a psychologist, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that as a psychologist. I would agree with that as a Buddhist.
Yeah.
And I agree with it in terms of the Shambhala teachings as well, that there's some failure to recognize our basic goodness.
Right.
It's like in the Buddhist tradition, the fundamental ignorance, basically.
Yeah, and you think it's a root cause of our anxieties and our depressions on a neurotic level, our sadnesses or whatever, on a neurotic level. Yeah.
It's where all that's
like a Freudian might think another conflict is, I mean, you think that's basic to understanding our neuroses.
I think so.
Yeah.
So it's a fundamental misperception of who we are.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Ed?
Yes, thank you again, Michael and John, for your comment earlier. I'd like to contrast two concepts that have been floating around. One is that of judgment and evaluation, and the other one is a sense of progress. So judgment and evaluation comes, I think, from a pre-existing worldview, and I seek the pardon of any Methodists in the audience, but the concept of being part of the elect, part of the chosen, right off the bat, is totally antithetical to everything we've been speaking about, because it involves an evaluation and a judgment imposed upon what you are. And Calvinism at its worst says that you can't do anything about it. Yet, for those of us who have chosen to follow the path, we're constantly seeking to deal, if you will, with the kleshas that have impeded our manifestation of our Buddha nature. So there's a progress and a process that is valid, at the same time that we're not judging ourselves or evaluating ourselves as we're engaged in that process, if you will.
I think it's interesting. I'd be curious to hear what other people think, but I think, it's another way you could think of the instruction and meditation practice about being not too tight and not too loose. That might be helpful in regard to what you're saying. Because we have to have some awareness. It's actually, I thought about just reading a little bit from the path of individual liberation, where he talks about the chapter Touch and Go. Just in regard to that notion of developing gentleness toward ourselves, because he starts the chapter by saying the attitude that brings about the possibility of mindfulness is mind's awareness of itself. Your mind is aware of itself, which means that you're aware that you're aware. But then he goes on to say, I'm skipping over a whole bunch, but a further touch is necessary. Touch is not simply the general awareness of being. It also applies to mindfulness of your individual states of mind. That is, your mental state of aggression or lust also has to be touched. Of course, it's not just aggression and lust, it's whatever we're experiencing. Jealousy, pride, anything that it's going through our mind. Such states have to be acknowledged. However, you do not just acknowledge them and push them off. You need to look at them without suppression or shying away. In that way, you actually have the experience of being utterly aggressive or utterly lustful, but you don't just politely say, hi, goodbye, it's nice seeing you again, but I want to get back to my breath. That would be like meeting an old friend and saying, excuse me, I have to catch the train and make my next appointment. Such an approach is somewhat deceptive. In shamatha, you don't just sign off, you acknowledge what's happening and you look at it. The basic point of shamatha is not to give yourself an easy time so you can escape the embarrassing, unpleasant, or self-conscious moments of life, whether they arise as painful memories of the past, painful experiences of the future, or painful experiences of the present. When such thoughts arise, you could experience them, look at them, and then come back to the breath. So again, there's a touching and letting go. And that part of that is allowing ourselves that level of self-acceptance of our experience, that we're actually able to just look at what we're experiencing without judging, without condemning, without grasping, without elaborating further. And then, as what we experience in meditation practices, that as with any momentary phenomena, they subside, so that we can actually work with ourselves without judgment. I don't know if that helps at all, but that was something else that was on my mind. Trying to get at the notion of what it means to be gentle to ourselves, which is not to immediately reject or push away our experience, but also not to indulge in it either. Touch and go.
Cat has a hand raised.
Oh, okay, good.
Thanks, Barry. First of all, thank you, Michael. That was a really amazing presentation of everything that we read. I appreciated also the synopsis of the first two chapters. I had read them, but I wasn't here last week. I was traveling. So it's funny. Everything you just said, that's what I was going to say. I had raised my hand before you started speaking. I feel that what he's trying to tell us is to give ourselves permission to feel the feelings, not especially the unpleasant ones. We always want them to go away. You know, it's like, okay, all right, I'm feeling it. Okay, I don't want to feel it anymore now. I felt it. Let it go away. Let it go away. But instead, kind of recognize the feeling and acknowledge that it's going to flow through. It is impermanent. It may be here for 5 minutes. It may be here for 5 days. But we have to have the fearlessness to be able to experience it and look at it, recognize it, but as you said, not grasp at it, not, you know, wish it to hurry up, not, you know, or if it's pleasurable, not want it to stay. It just has to flow through, like, you know, standing on a bridge, watching the river go by, same thing. And we have to, I think, not judge ourselves for why can't I concentrate? Why am I angry today? You know, why can't I just be happy? You know, we feelings come when they come and they go when they go, and fearlessness and being open to examine things as they are going by, that's difficult, especially when it comes to fear and sadness. You want to examine, like you said, without wallowing, and it's balance. I think that's the key. That's the word I'm looking for here. It's balance, finding the balance and recognition, but not wallowing. Not judging ourselves for being, you know, why am I afraid of this? I've done this 100 times. Why fear? And ego makes it very easy to just, you know, your ego is talking to you. At least me, I should say me. My ego's always in there, judging me, judge. And that's what I'm working toward, is being gentle with myself and realizing that emotions are not good or bad. Emotions are emotions. Feelings are feelings. We're humans. We're meant to feel them all. And the other thing that you mentioned that I also found very interesting and jumped out at me was when he mentioned original sin, and how he, you know, what is this? Babies are born with original sin? What is this? I frankly, growing up, my public school closed, and the only other school in the neighborhood was a Roman Catholic, and I'm not judging them. But that's one of the concepts they believe in. And I was like, wait, what? Little babies are born with sin from their ancestor? I didn't understand that either. Frankly, I don't believe that. I believe we are born with inherent goodness. We are born with the Buddhahood inside of us, and we are, life's work, some of us, is to discover how to just get out of our own way and let that shine through, let that come out, and let it be.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'd say in regard to feelings is that we learn through meditation practice that we can experience feelings and not lose our recognition of our awareness. And also in regard to original sin, I think, you know, there's a lot of besides just the ideas that exist in the different Catholic and Protestant traditions, even if we don't necessarily adhere to any of those ideas, we oftentimes in our culture, we have some idea that there's something wrong, something that needs to be fixed in us, or that we're lacking in some way. So it might not be original sin in the sense of, the biblical notion of that, but we have that kind of belief that somehow we're flawed, or that we need to be fixed, or that and it manifests itself in very, very subtle and sometimes very coarse, but very subtle ways. Even just the feeling in sitting meditation that somehow whatever we're experiencing should be better or different in some way, so that we look for a different now than the one we're actually experiencing. All right. Karen Sue, you had your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you everyone for your comments. And what Karen's first comment, your first comment about, and other people have alluded to this, the hard and the soft, the happy, the sad. What came to my mind was wonderfully simply, Thich Nhat Hanh's no mud, no lotus.
Yeah.
And that says it all for me. Thanks.
Could you actually say a little more about what that does mean to you?
If there is no mud, then there would be no absolutely beautiful lotus. And a lot of times that from that, when I think about that, I'm reminded that nothing is permanent. Mm-hmm. So if I'm in pain or physical pain or emotional pain, I sit with that, knowing that it's going to change. I don't know what it's going to change to, but out of the mud comes a very beautiful, beautiful thing to experience.
Thank you. What I like about our discussions is that we are all teaching and reminding each other. Anyway, Philip, hand raised.
Michael, thank you so much. I had trouble personally feeling engaged with these chapters, and I found your talk wonderfully helpful in moving me past that. Another way to say the same thing that people are saying, or maybe looking at it from a different direction, is simply to appreciate what is. And that thought comes up in all the teachings all the time, and in these teachings, to simply appreciate what is. As Americans in particular, we have this, this burden we labor under, whose motto might be, more is never enough. But what we have is more than enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Don and then Miriam.
Hi, thank you, Michael. Really wonderful teaching. It really brought this reading alive for me. There was a part in the chapter, The Genuine Heart of Sadness. Mm-hmm. In my book I'm holding now, it's page 29. And he's talking about basic goodness. And anyway, he makes this point, the same principle applies to our makeup as human beings. We have passion, aggression, and ignorance. That is, we cultivate our friends and we ward off our enemies, and we are occasionally indifferent. those tendencies are not regarded as shortcomings. They are part of the natural elegance and equipment of human beings. And I don't know, that was interesting to me because the way I'm reading it and being used to Dharma teachings is that I always regarded those things as problematic. And he's saying that don't regard that as our enemies to ward off. That's actually part of our natural equipment and the elegance of being human. So I just looking for clarification.
What I'm trying to do is think of an answer in Shambhalian terms, because in the Vajrayana, one aspect of the Vajrayana is seeing the wisdom in all experiences, so that, or the sanity in all experiences. And it's easier if, be easier for me to answer from a Buddhist point of view, especially if we studied the Buddha families and, the neurotic and sane expressions of different emotions. But I think even in the Shambhala sense, I don't think it means that in any way that we want to indulge in passion, aggression, or ignorance. So it doesn't change that doesn't change our Hinayana understanding of the need for discipline and the need to not create the kind of habitual patterns that come out of acting on passion, aggression, and ignorance. Doesn't change the Mahayana teachings in terms of, putting others before ourselves so that we don't act on the basis of passion, aggression, and ignorance. So I think I think he's essentially meaning the same thing here, and even in the Shambhala sense, that yes, if we lose our awareness, if we lose our seat, if we end up indulging, then passion, aggression, and ignorance create tremendous obstacles and problems for us and other people. But in their fundamental nature, they're good. It's it's a matter of how we work with them and how we work with those situations. And but again, maybe John can bail me out here. Be easier if it's strictly Buddhist point of view.
I've had same difficulty, Michael, but with this added thought about it, when a klesha, or like passion or aggression or ignorance arises, when we're caught in it, we're not awarely aware that it's gripping us. Instead, what we're doing is we're trying to get rid of it by acting out. So if it's aggression, we want to attack. We want to somehow cathart it. Same with passion and ignorance, that we're so involved in acting them out and trying to get rid of them that we don't even know that we've got them. We're just involved. And the teachings, especially, what you were alluding to, the Vajrayana teachings, they enjoin us to come back and see what's happening, see that passion and that aggression, that it is part of our makeup, and that in doing that, in Buddhist terms, then we can transmute them, or we can recognize them as being a legitimate part of us, but we don't have to act on them. And when we act, we're always trying to get rid of them. They're painful. So I think that the first message that I got is to stop doing that, to stop trying to get rid of them and to see it. You can't see it when you're trying to get rid of it, when you're trying to act it out. You're too involved in it.
Yeah.
That's my thought.
I think the only other thing I'd add is when we're acting on the basis of aggression, in particular, passion and ignorance, we're not experiencing sad and tender heart.
Definitely. And perhaps part of at least what sad and tender heart means is having some compassion for ourselves, that we don't have to try and get rid of this, that we can acknowledge what we're experiencing as being part of who we are at the moment. Perhaps that's part of sad and tender heart too. Because when we're involved in trying to get rid of that aggression, let's say, that hatred, that anger, we're acting on it, there's not much sadness and tenderness. Pain. You think?
The other thing that I guess as both you, Michael, and John were sharing your answers, which I appreciate, is like how some of these things are related to, like, for example, like literal thirst or literal hunger. Like, acting on that in and of itself is not a problem. You know, like, and like what you were saying earlier about danger, Michael. I mean, if I step out into the street and all of a sudden I see a car barreling down the street and I jump back on the curb, you know, I mean, in a way that's like warding off my enemies, right? So like in a certain context, being a human and living is not problematic. I mean, maybe I'm just grasping at straws here, but I thought of like, maybe that's another way to look at it, you know, like where he was talking about we have teeth and we have nails and genitals and all of that, like using those things in and of themselves, in and of itself maybe isn't problematic, but it can be problematic if it turns into a form of, I don't know, escape or whatever.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to add, because I've been wrestling with this too, and in parallel reading about different types of therapies, and you know, all of this has everything to do with experiential avoidance. And so wanting to avoid an inner experience that's uncomfortable, and it, you know, in keeping with the chapter, this is very natural. It makes a lot of sense. Our brains have evolved to solve problems. And we feel this discomfort, this fear. We're programmed to act on it either directly or get away from it ASAP. And it takes some undoing, it seems to me, because when you start running from it, then you have good reasons to be afraid of that experience. And it, in and of itself, acquires this avoidance quality that, you know, has to be undone, so to speak. So exposure is the answer in therapy language. But I think in Buddhist language it's about, well, the meditative practice of opening to it and having the courage to just experience it. But I think too, as we move along, there's a form of insight which adds wisdom to the experience of the pain. And that sounds like it's temporary, it's impermanent, or it's not really me. Like, I don't know. I have a feeling like as insight grows, the experience of emotions also changes. And maybe it's because there is that sense of basic goodness, or there is no self as such, which changes the landscape of emotional experiences. I don't know. I'm seeing it very much in stages, a little bit like the texts that were written, the volumes that we've been studying. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit, but these were my thoughts on that.
Okay. Yeah, thank everyone. I think that, again, one of the things I've always appreciated about the Shambhala teachings is they do present a challenge to us. And that there's, again, there's no place to hide in these teachings. It's once we understand what he's asking us to do, asking us to recognize and actually begin looking at our experience. I think maybe time for Fred, and then it'll be 9 o'clock, so we should close. Go ahead, Fred.
Hi. I really love this chapter, and it was, the exact experience I had a week before it. Like the whole world started breaking my heart, especially people start dying, and it's like now we have sudden adult death syndrome, and I sort of realized this weekend, that the good and the bad news of this world is it's going to tear your heart open, and I'm wondering, is this pointing us to the third reminder that there's nothing good about samsara? That's what I'm taking listening to all you guys.
That's worth contemplating.
Michael, I just wanted to add quickly that your presentation was very helpful in expanding on the material, because it's easy to read it and not grasp the depth of it. So thank you.
Ed, if it's something quick.
It actually is, it's a suggested answer to Frederick's question, as that is there nothing that there's nothing good in samsara. I would say there's everything good in samsara, and at the end of the day, it's neither good nor bad. It's not for us to apply our conditioned judgment on what gets dealt to us by the world and by life, but to on a relative level, realize that we do enjoy things and we do not like things, but to see through that to a much more holistic and comprehensive understanding of the world as it is.
Well, I think it comes down to how we respond to the world, and but it's and then we have the line in our opening chant: grant your blessings so that I realize the inseparability of samsara and nirvana, which comes down to, again, how we perceive and how we respond to the world around us. But at the same time, samsara is unendurable, unbearably intense. In any case, we shall close with the prayer for peace, and so I'll mute us all, and the dedication of merit for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the radiance wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. So thank you, everyone.
Oh.